This video is sponsored by World Anvil. This is the next installment in my series about villains in tabletop RPGs. Today we're going to talk about a Wizards of the Coast product that can help you create original villains who are interesting and dynamic and dramatic. But before we get into the meat of today's topic, I'd like to first set the stage by talking about the official tools we were given before this book came out. Let's briefly talk about the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. I'll probably make a more comprehensive video about this book some other time, but honestly, it seems like I use the DMG way more than most of my fellow D&D YouTubers. And honestly, I really only use the same 6 charts over and over. And 2 of those charts are about randomly generating villains for my adventures. Now, these are fairly simple charts. The first is just a chart to determine who is the villain in the dungeon, and it's so broad. Here's the chart. It's just a d20 roll of general descriptions like giant bent on plunder, undead with any agenda, humanoid conqueror, or humanoid under a curse. Like I said, very, very simple. The second chart I use offers a motivation for the villain. What is their goal? You roll a d8 to see what your villain's scheme focuses on, things like influence, immortality, or mayhem. And then there's some subcharts to help you get more specific. For example, under the umbrella scheme of passion, you can roll a d4 to see if the villain is trying to keep a loved one alive, or earn someone's love, or resurrect a lost love, or bump off the competition for someone's affection. Now, these charts are pretty bare bones, but I have a long history of loving movies and TV and comic books and thinking critically about villains, so these charts work fine for my needs. I can use them as a starting point just to figure out who my villain will be, and then I can take my years of opinions and theory and flesh out the villain with details and, hopefully, depth. I can come up with a lot once I have the basics sorted out, which is why these charts are great for me, because often I just need a prompt to get going.
All I need is an idea.
But for years, literally more than half a decade, these were the only tools 5e provided to create your own villain. There's plenty of lore in the monster manual that can grant inspiration, and there are seeds planted in campaign settings that you can cultivate for your own story, but as far as advice for creating a campaign villain from scratch, this was it. Actually, no, there's a third chart. It comes right after the one about schemes, and it's just terrible. I mean, I suppose someone could find it useful, but I find that the results almost never provide anything half as interesting as the schemes chart, and the results of both charts almost never work well together. If I roll and determine that a villain wants to overthrow a government, how does torturing someone with thumbscrews do that? One of the results for the villainous method is just neglect. That's the villain's method? What the hell am I supposed to do with that? There's also a chart to determine the villain's secret weakness, which I literally forgot was in the Dungeon Master's Guide until I was writing this script. And then there's the villainous class options for the Death Domain Cleric and the Oathbreaker Paladin, and that's it. From what I can tell, those are the only official 5e tools that offered guidance to make memorable villains. But those first 2 charts are fine for what they are. They're just a jumping off point. But regardless of how useful these charts are individually, they're made worse by virtue of the fact that these 4 charts were the only resource in the whole of 5e for creating original villains. I like 2 of these charts, I use them all the time, but when they're basically all the game gives you, they become a pretty insufficient resource. But you probably saw the title of this video, so you probably know that Wizards of the Coast finally took steps to fill this deficiency by giving us tools to create really complex, thematically rich villains in 2021 when they published Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So how'd they do? Well, let's take a look at the book and find out. If you want to help support the channel, consider signing up for my Patreon. Videos like this where I do a really comprehensive deep dive into published books take a lot of time, so having some financial support helps me out a lot. Now let's get into the video. If you're not familiar with this setting, Ravenloft is a collection of demi-planes, basically pocket realities, and each one is designed to torment and imprison a Darklord, who is usually one of the most wicked individuals in the D&D multiverse. This video isn't a review of the Ravenloft campaign setting, we'll do that another time. Today we're really just evaluating the book's advice on creating compelling villains. And some of the advice is really specific to the kinds of villains Ravenloft focuses on, because Darklords are specifically meant to be truly irredeemable, evil, tormented prisoners of their own demons made manifest. And while there's a lot of great stuff there, that's not right for every adventure. But right on page 10, we get some spectacular advice for your villain, no matter whether they're irredeemable or not. Darklords should be active. Darklords might brood over their failures, but nevertheless they relentlessly strive to achieve their ambitions. Their desperate struggles fuel their conflicts with characters. Liberally use Darklords in your adventures rather than saving them for distant climactic plots. I know there's a tradition of keeping villains at the bottom level of the dungeon, waiting in their lair for the heroes to arrive, and there's a virtue to that idea. But to truly craft great villains, I think they need agency. And I think this approach is just one way to do that, but it's a really useful one. They need to be able to get into the player's grills. Sure, you're risking the chance that they'll die early, but you can make fail-safes to account for that. Maybe the version of the villain that the party kills is actually a simulacrum made of snow, or they can only truly be killed with a specific weapon or by destroying the One Ring. There are lots of ways to keep your villain alive, but still have them confront your players throughout the campaign. But we've discussed giving villains agency before and making them present throughout the campaign. Surely this big book of villain advice has more to say than just that. Oh yes, because Chapter 2 gives us the meaty advice about making Darklords. And the first piece of advice is something I love. Make them a sinister reflection of the player characters. There's a lot of great advice here for different approaches to do that. For example, they might have exaggerated versions of some of the player's own personality traits, ideals, bonds, or flaws. Or they can hold opposite beliefs. In either case, they're going to wind up directly at odds with the players in some really interesting ways. The next section asks about the Darklord's early life, and there's some excellent writing prompt questions here. For example, along with questions like who the Darklord's family was and what their childhood was like, we get questions like, how was the Darklord's family oppressed, oppressive, or both? And also, whose respect or love did the Darklord crave? I get very wary of writing exercises that encourage you to dive all the way into a character's backstory because I don't always think it's necessary, but the process of creating a Darklord does benefit a lot from building a complete picture of this villain's life. Then it encourages you to pick your villain's ideals, bonds, and flaws, but again, we get some excellent advice. The book tells us that your villain's bond shouldn't be power, and there's a great reason for that. Power isn't an end in itself. Power is a means to obtain a bond. And then, as if they weren't doing well enough, they break down why Darklords should have a really good flaw, and give you a random chart of possible fatal flaws. I love it. And then we get something that, again, might be specific to Darklords. It might not be necessary for every villain you create, but I still think it's really useful to know how to do this right. Darklords need to be corrupt beyond redemption. This encourages you to figure out what evil acts the Darklord performed, who they harmed, give their victims names so it feels more real, and then make it clear that the Darklord will never atone, no matter how many chances they get. They are fundamentally broken, and they will never see the error of their ways. Now, there are lots of other ways to create villains. For example, your villain might be sympathetic. We'll talk about that some other time. But I've also seen a lot of game masters on Reddit or Twitter lament that, in their games, their villains are always too easily convinced to change their ways. The players make really reasonable arguments, and these GMs relent. So if you're trying to craft a certain type of irredeemable villain, this book has some really helpful advice. And it doubles down on this throughout the book. When we get to the section about the domain of dread, it asks you to come up with some basically triggers in the domain that cause the Darklord to keep reliving their past sins in a way that makes them unable to move on and heal. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to the domain advice soon, because it actually helps a lot when discussing crafting cool villains, even if they aren't Darklords. The next section is about using everything you've come up with to develop your Darklord, and through some more prompts, convert that backstory into a clear narrative. This will help give you the dramatic material you need to craft the Domain of Dread as the perfect torment for the villain. Now here's the thing. Writing backstory is a very slippery slope for players and GMs. Technically, when GMs do it, it's not called backstory, it's called world building or lore, but it's the same thing. It can be really tempting to spend a lot of time going down a rabbit hole, writing a bunch of stuff that you don't really need, and that probably won't all matter, just because it's fun. But this book validates that impulse by showing how this villainous backstory can inform your decisions as you create a richer domain of dread and generate meaningful NPCs that the heroes can ally with. Then we get a chart of monstrous transformations the Darklord can experience once they get plunged into Ravenloft, and honestly, they're fine. They're a good starting point, I guess, but I feel like they're a little bit limited. Then again, I like when villains look normal. I'd much rather a Darklord look like a normal dude but have the stats of an adult dragon, rather than a Darklord with, like, 3 eyes or sharp teeth or something. So, now you've put together everything you've got so far. You figured out how your Darklord became the horrible person they are, and what horrible deed they did that caused the cosmic forces of the multiverse to whisk them off to their own private Idaho. So it's time to get some advice on creating that land, the Darklord's Domain of Dread. Now, once again, most of this advice is specific to the Darklord of a Domain of Dread, but a lot of it is applicable to our needs as well. Your villain doesn't have to be supernaturally linked to the land itself, but I do think that these prompts can still help you think about ways to make the villain's lair and surrounding environment reflect the most interesting themes of that villain's core beliefs or fatal flaws. Heck, not even all of the Darklords are literal rulers of their domains of dread, they're just someone with a lot of influence on the environment. In this book, that influence is supernatural, but it's also usually rationalized in the text. Sure, Jacqueline Renner has a lot of control over the domain of Ravenloft, but she doesn't have to be a Darklord for that to be possible. It's justified through the influence she holds over the people, as well as her membership in the secret faction of were-rats that live in the sewers. So even if you strip away the domains of dread trappings, this advice behind creating the villain's home court is still really useful for our purposes. And in the vein of creating a thematically relevant setting for the villain to live in, I want to highlight this line. To start creating your domain, choose 3 of the evil acts your Darklord committed. Consider selecting those that best complement the player's characters and that don't conflict with any boundaries discussed in your group's Session 0. Once again, I love that this book says that your first impulse when creating your villain should be to start with your player characters. It's a really marvelous way to make sure the entire adventure is crafted in such a way that your friends feel like they're playing heroes, fighting against their own personal supervillains, deliberately designed to bring out the best parts of the party, or perhaps to reflect their worst attributes back at them. I also love this piece of advice. When developing the local cultures of your region, it proposes you make choices based on what would be the most unsettling to your Darklord. Because we're putting the villain first, we're crafting an environment that agitates or tortures the villain, which further incentivizes them to be active in the story because there's something they feel they need to fix. It also acts as a dark mirror of the villain's psyche, so wherever the heroes go in the region, even if the villain isn't literally nearby, they'll still feel the villain's presence through these parallels and connections. And because the villain is modeled after some of the hero's own qualities, this approach will help create an environment that's designed to provoke a reaction from both your villain and your player characters. If you can ask these deep, thought-provoking questions about your villains and make settings that reflect their inner conflict, then you can learn how to ask these same questions about your heroes to develop other deeply personal adventures about their backstories and their flaws and their desires. In fact, if you've been following the steps from the book, then you've already started to do just that. To finish off this section, we get a couple of charts that I think are pretty cool. The first is Darklord Connections, which you can roll on to help give your player characters some link with the Darklord. My favorite is the one where a player character is a reincarnated younger version of the villain from before they became irredeemable. As someone who has really enjoyed a lot of the Young Avengers comics, anything that gives me big Iron Lad energy is awesome. And then we get a chart of the possible ways the Darklord can interact with the heroes through the course of the adventure. Things like inviting them to dinner, sending them letters, possessing a beloved NPC, meeting them somewhere that no one can fight, that kind of thing. These prompts are specifically designed to get you thinking about non-violent ways your villains can interact with the heroes, and yeah, I honestly think that every compelling villain should have at least one moment or method like this with the heroes. I don't know, I love these kinds of interactions, but you knew that about me already. The next section of the book is called Genres of Horror, and at first, this seems very specific to a horror-themed campaign setting like Ravenloft, but honestly, there's still a lot of great stuff here. Every section offers some great insights into what sort of fears come into play through each type of horror story, and certain pitfalls to avoid. For example, aside from the fact that the first 2 sentences into the body horror introduction, I realize there's a lot of stuff about body horror stories that I do not like, especially when it involves gore. The book is clear that the gore is secondary to the primary fears body horror evokes about change and mortality. But it also warns that it's very easy for body horror stories to portray disabilities as monstrous, and it's good to be aware of that. Likewise, the book details how cosmic horror stories are about a loss of control, but also cautions against how easily those stories promote xenophobia or stigmatize mental illness. Even if you don't ultimately agree with their conclusions about what makes certain types of horror frightening or affecting, it's still useful to have this in the back of your mind to help guide your decision-making process when crafting a campaign. Additionally, most genres of horror presented in the book come with a chart of random villain concepts, and each villain idea really shows off some of the cool stuff about those genres. For example, the body horror villains are vastly different from the cosmic horror villains, who are wildly different from the dark fantasy villains, and so on. It's really cool to see these ideas divided up in ways that explain what makes these kinds of stories compelling. Honestly, all of these descriptions and all the charts in the genres of horror section are all extremely useful and good. Now, we're basically done with the step-by-step guidance the book gives us on making interesting and dynamic villains, but that doesn't mean the back half of the book has no more useful advice. Because Chapter 3 is by far the thickest section of the book, and it's just full of examples of domains of dread and their Darklords. And aside from some of these domains just being awesome places to drop into your own campaign, there's a lot of useful material we can pull from these examples when building our own villains. First of all, Chapter 3 teaches us that these Darklords are designed so they can only be killed or overthrown in the most dramatically appropriate ways. For some of them, that means killing them. Hell, even in Curse of Strahd, you need to go find some magic items, but the goal is still to fight Strahd and kill him to death. But other Dark Lords are designed to have different dramatic payoffs to their story. For example, Isolde actually can be redeemed if you get her away from her evil magic sword. Duchess Sidra is obsessed with status, and you can't truly defeat her until you unmask her and expose her as a fraud. I think this is something we can keep in mind for our own games as well. There are plenty of villains where it just doesn't matter. There's no inherently ideal way for them to be murdered, or at least not one that makes sense to try to steer your campaign toward. But for villains with certain patterns of behavior, or in the case of the Dark Lords, villains who are cursed with various forms of eternal life, you should maybe think about what might actually be the most dramatic ending to their story. What is the most cathartic way to finish off this villain? Another useful feature of Chapter 3 is that every Dark Lord wants something. Angtipot wants to find his missing Ka, Harkon Lucas wants praise, Xian Qiang wants a perfect kingdom, and so on. And some of the Dark Lords have a few different potential motivations, so you can either choose whatever best fits your group, or roll randomly. But they all have a goal that helps push the story forward in fascinating ways. Again, this is so useful for us to remember in our own villains. It's not enough to have the villains already have everything they wanted. In the real world, lots of people, historically it's hard to believe, but it's true, lots of people have gotten everything they wanted. Not a single one of them ever had a moment in their life where they stopped wanting something. Heck, even monks who give up worldly possessions to meditate on the meaning of life want enlightenment. And the ones who believe that they found it want to share that enlightenment with others. And also, not for nothing, but your villains probably aren't as content with their life as a monk who figured out inner peace. In fact, if you want your heroes to fight the villain, I strongly feel that your villain should want something so strongly, it's unreasonable. Even if their goal is objectively noble, the path they're taking should be brutal or wrong-headed. I think it's useful to point out that some of these Dark Lords want things that are objectively perfectly reasonable. Drakov is the Dark Lord of Falkovnia. She's a brutal general who rules with an iron fist, but her entire goal is to stop her city from being overwhelmed by zombies. Don't get me wrong, she really is evil and she needs to be removed from power, but I'm willing to bet that the players would agree with her that getting torn apart by zombies is bad. But once the players see Drakov in action, they'll second guess her. They'll try to find another path. But Drakov is a Dark Lord. She can't change, and she can't be reasoned with. She just has to be dealt with. Her being unreasonable is constantly getting people killed. And that's just one of many examples. The book is honestly full of them. Your villains need to be the kind of people that adventurers want to kill or overthrow. So they certainly can't be passive villains. Trust me, if the players feel like the villains aren't an urgent threat, they'll never, ever go fight them. They'll just chase down every side quest instead. Each example domain also gives you a bunch of sample adventure hooks, so you can figure out what your party might be asked to do, or what kind of trouble they'll get into when they travel to this Dark Lord's realm. Now, there are just some really good adventure hooks throughout these charts, but even more than that, these adventures are often great representations of the themes embodied by each of these Dark Lords and their domains. For example, the domain of Lamortia is heavily inspired by the story of Frankenstein, so most of the sample adventures have to do with lab experiments and test subjects. But a lot of these adventures also encourage the players to make a choice about how they feel about these scientific advancements. Do they want to be accomplices to some of these, frankly, unsettling procedures? Or will they deny the requests of these quest givers? Is there even always an objective right answer? Or does it depend on the players' perspectives of each of the NPCs involved? The domain of Borka centers on two nobles at war, so just about all of the example adventures are about encouraging the player characters to make a choice about who to ally with, or who to support, or even just who they feel like they can safely associate themselves with. If you read these entries about each domain and go over the charts of example adventures, you can see how having a strong, driving idea behind your villain and their environment can help tie your adventures together thematically. Additionally, just about every domain has some other interesting mechanic or feature that you can build upon for your adventures. Not all of them are necessarily as fleshed out as I might like, but again, when we're just using this book as inspiration, they're all still really useful. You can look at the mechanics they give you and see how they reinforce the theme of that domain. For example, Borka and Kalakiri are both domains that are centrally focused on a power struggle between relative equals. Kalakiri's entry offers a renown system, similar to the one in The Rise of Tiamat, and apparently it's also in the Dungeon Master's Guide? I don't know. Nobody knows if that's true. No one knows what's in that book. But the purpose of the renown system is to track the player's position with each faction. This way, your players can perform favors for the different patrons and gain status, or perform deeds that get them on the wrong side of certain groups. But Borka doesn't use a system like that. Instead, it offers guidance on how the various nobles will gladly work with the party, and gives you the tools so you can play these nobles as cunning backstabbers, preparing to get leverage on the player characters for their own political ends. In both cases, this choice was made because it helped to reinforce the core theme of the domain and the Dark Lord, and that's really useful for us to observe and learn from. The last thing I want to say about this book is that, honestly, some of these Darklords are just more interesting than others. And that's okay. When you read this book, if you decide to read this book, you might find that some of these villains are far more compelling than I think they are. Some of my favorite Darklords might do nothing for you. That's cool. Reading about this wide array of villains gives you a chance to figure out what you like about villains and steal those qualities for your own campaigns. Speaking of stealing stuff for my own campaign, I basically fell head over heels for some of these domains. I mean, I'd be excited for a very short campaign set in Falkovnia. I think I'd have a great time playing Drakov, and I think my brother-in-law's D&D character might find himself in Harakir before too long, but I actually adore the idea of a full 5 or 8 level Darkon campaign. But of course, the Darkon excerpt is only 6 pages long. That's hardly enough material for me to run a whole campaign with no prep. I want to flesh out the world, build out the relevant NPCs and locations and events, all sorts of things that I would need more than 6 pages to cover. Thankfully, I can use today's sponsor, World Anvil, to create a comprehensive campaign roadmap, complete with individual articles for each location and character, a timeline of events, and practical tools that help me come up with content when I get stumped. And thankfully, I can decide which material I want to show the players and what content I still want to keep hidden. And you can do the same for your campaign. World Anvil has agreed to sponsor this video, so if you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 40% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching. Look, I know this is kind of a weird time to be talking about how much I like this Wizards of the Coast book, given, the year they've had so far. But I do think this book is really well made and has a lot of useful material for game masters who want to enhance their villains. And at the end of the day, that's my biggest priority for this series. But that being said, if you'd like to get your hands on this book, I encourage you to go pick it up at your local gaming store. They need your support much more than some of the big bookstores do, and certainly more than Wizards of the Coast does. If you want to help support me, you can subscribe and ring the bell. YouTube uses that information to know whether or not they should recommend this channel to more people, so if you want people to watch this channel, and I hope that you do, those are ways to make that happen. You can support me on Patreon or check out my wish lists. If you can't support me financially, that's cool. I would still love to have you join my Discord community. Be sure to follow me on Twitch. I try to go live at least once a week. And you can sign up for my newsletter to stay up to date on my latest news. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. If you want to watch another video I made that also talks about how to build an adventure based on which characters your players rolled up, check out my video about an example of building a combat encounter. Until next time, play fair and have fun. I'm so tired. One of my dogs had diarrhea all night last night. I got like 2 hours of sleep. I'm gonna go die.